and get started. So I'm going to turn this over to Justin Keating, who will be moderating the session today. And thanks to Justin and to all our panelists.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending. My name is Justin Keating. I'm the treasurer of the Virginia LERA chapter. And I am hosting today's meeting on what I call frenemies or unlikely alliances, sort of new creative ways of having more cooperative labor management relationships. When I was thinking of a topic for my panel, I knew that much of what people see in the media, or much of what I think we think of when we think of labor management relations, is fight until somebody ends up, a war of attrition. By the time it's done, you go on Twitter now. I know because of the work that I do. I'm at a small private law firm called Baasten, Sraga, and Keating, and one of my client groups is a lot of Teamster locals. So you go on Twitter now, you see a lot of stuff about the Teamsters and UPS. They're headed for a big fight, and it's got all the cliches of going to war and everything else for their July 31st contract expiration. And I think one of the things that has surprised me as I've gone through the past 23 years in the field, and I think would surprise a lot of people, is that there are many relationships out there between labor and management that have realized that there is a better way of doing things. So we have some guests today that I think have some interesting experience and advice that I'm hoping all the attendees can not only find interesting, but sort of take home to figure out how they can apply this to the things that they work on. So our first panel member, well, our three panel members in no particular order, are Lisa Callaway, and I'm going to flip over to my bio thing here, from the law firm Engler, Callaway, Baasten, and Sraga in Chicago, or outside of Chicago. Lisa represents management in labor and employment law, public sector, private sector, education sectors. She's a fellow in the College of Labor and Employment Lawyers, and we came upon her because she has some very interesting experience in public sector collective bargaining that has found a way to be less than knockdown, drag out type typical stuff. The second panel member is Katie Finn from the International Transport Workers Federation, where she is the global campaigns manager. The ITF, as they call it, is a global union federation representing 700 affiliated trade unions from 153 different countries. Before that, she worked for a long time at the Teamsters Union in their organizing department, their passenger transportation division, and as their national field director in the political department. So in her case, both her current job and her previous one, I think, has some experience that becomes interesting for today's discussion. And our third panel member is Don Slayman from IBEW Local 26, which is the electric workers local here in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And Don has been doing some interesting work that he can talk about a little more as we go along, interesting work in which him and the IBEW and the contractors see that they have some common ground in trying to lobby local governments and so on for better projects. And he can talk more about that when we get to him. So I think to get things started, what I was thinking is if I could have each one of the panel members just give a short sort of one or two examples of, in their time, situations in which they have been able to creatively find a solution in more cooperative labor management relations than the typical stuff like I talked about, like we see in movies and all the media ever talks about. I'll start with Lisa.
Thanks, Justin. Nice to see you all today. Thank you for joining. So I've been doing this for, I think I'm in my 33rd year, and all I've ever done is management side labor relations. We have a very vibrant labor relations community in Chicago and Illinois, and I believe we were the second state to have a public sector labor statute. So, so it's been around for quite some time. And I think, and I'm not sure I can answer your question exactly, Justin, but I'll answer kind of more globally, because this is really how I've run my practice. And I've worked at a number of firms before we started our firm with really a different focus about 9 years ago. I'm a huge proponent of collaborative bargaining in many different sectors. I don't think it just works in the educational sector. I think it works in a lot of different sectors. And you know, what prior to that, and it's I would say that's a newer phenomenon, certainly, but prior to that, I realized that I think I was going to be a lot less stressed and not keep, you know, Rolaids and Tums in business forever, if I could come up with a, you know, foster a positive, good relationship with the people on the other side of the table and the people that I would be working with. And not to say that everything goes smoothly, certainly, and there are certainly some people that hasn't been possible to do. But, you know, I have really tried to say, listen, we're both trying to get to the same place. We've got a relationship that has to withstand this particular negotiation. And in most cases, I'm going to leave, and, you know, my colleague on the other side of the table is going to leave. So how do we get to where we want to go as quickly as possible? It doesn't always happen that way, certainly, but I would say, you know, to answer the question of, you know, I guess I'm giving a more global answer, but certainly trying to find common ground and keeping that relationship professional, so that person knows, you know, you can pick up the phone, you can call me in between negotiation sessions, you know, let's get things moving as fast as we can. And I'm going to welcome that conversation, and I'm going to do the same thing.
Interesting. So Katie gets to travel to all kinds of interesting and exotic places for her job, but I think right now she's actually in Iowa, which is not a different country, believe it or not, for those of us in DC. Katie, would you like to give some examples?
Absolutely. In fact, I have two actually fairly specific examples. So I'll go the opposite route to Lisa, but I think it helps to just kind of put things into focus. As Justin mentioned, I work for the International Transport Workers Federation, a global union federation of transport unions, right? So moving freight and people, whether it be by road, rail, air, or sea, is sort of our purview there. And as a global union federation, we're not in the business of negotiating CBAs with particular employers, right? That's the work of our affiliated unions. But one of the roles we play is sort of at that global level, being able to work with multinational corporations, which they're growing and more as we see, to help to sort of set terms of engagement and sort of minimum standards within their supply chains that then hopefully at the end of the day make it easier for the affiliated unions and the company's operations in any given country to sort of work within, you know, at least we know where the floor is, you can determine the ceiling. And so one example I give that there was a company, we call them economic employers. Essentially, these are going to be the clients of your transportation companies, your logistics companies. At the end of the day, these are the ones that are making the widgets or growing the widgets and needing to get those around the world. And more you're seeing economic employers committing to maintaining high standards when it comes to environmental, social, et cetera, issues within their operations, and labor falls into that, right? And it's all well and good, and we appreciate the commitment, but as we all appreciate, need to see that in action, right? And so we worked with one economic employer, a major global player, who in writing, everything that comes out from their board has shown a commitment to maintaining high standards when it comes to the treatment of workers, regardless of where it is across the world, regardless of where it is in their supply chain. With that said, our unions, our affiliated unions, identified issues with the treatment of workers in their supply chains. Being able to document those issues very well, developed a dossier of said issues. And here's that moment where it comes to Justin's piece about constructive work together. Very easily, could have just gone to the media, put it out in the press, put it online, put the company on blast, right? We chose a different path because we believe in this power of negotiation and finding common ground. So instead, taking that dossier to the economic employer saying, hey, you've said this, but here's what we're finding, right? Give them a chance to obviously investigate, see what they find. And they came back and said, you're right, right? There was a gap in their supply chains and these high standards. That work we did And the company's willingness to work with us led to the development of what we call a global framework agreement. This is a binding document that's negotiated by both sides, sets again sort of those expectations, creates space for communication where issues can be raised, ideally resolved, and then remedied and enforced. And that's exactly what we've seen, to the point now where this economic employer we would consider a partner, where we work together with them. We jointly fund an effort to inspect their supply chains when there's issues identified, raise those, bring them to them, and create a space for that mitigation of that risk. So that's a very global example, kind of very at that 30,000 foot level, but how you can imagine that kind of eases the efforts as you get in any given country or in any given union or company's local operations. And then just very briefly, Justin, if you don't mind, I'd like to touch on one more example, that coming from my experience at the Teamsters Union. As you mentioned, I worked as the coordinator of our passenger transportation division. These were primarily privatized school bus drivers, transit drivers, and in an instance where a major player in North America, when we tried to organize their workers, we ran time and time again into unfair labor practices, definitely a very hostile environment, and one that wasn't good for anyone, right? And as I know, I think Lisa said, I think we were all popping a lot of Tums for many years. But eventually we were able to come to a point where both the union and the company agreed to sit down and see if we can negotiate something. What came out of that was a mutually agreed, negotiated freedom of association policy and organizing agreement that essentially stipulated within an organizing campaign the do's and don'ts of both sides. There was a process to raise issues and to make sure that things could be enforced. And so I think, again, when you're organizing, the organizing phase of labor relations is very different than the negotiation, which is very different than the day-to-day, labor relations, and that dynamic will shift. But I just wanted to point that out as another example of where I think by being willing to come to the table, no commitments that we were going to get the deal done, but inevitably we did, because I think both sides saw the self-interest in that, and that agreement is still in place, and I think has allowed for, frankly, the labor peace that exists, but in a way where both parties have sort of that equal seat at the table, and I think the trust is being built. So I'll leave it with that.
Interesting. Before we go to Don, I will say to the participants out there, I consider these very much to be interactive conversations. So raise your virtual hand if you have a question or something to add, and I'll call on you. One of the benefits of these is that you can ask questions. You have 3 people on the panel who have a lot of interesting experience, and if you can benefit from any of that, that's definitely something good to walk away with. And Don, when you give yours also, you can give a little more of your bio. I didn't have a very full bio for you, so go ahead, Don.
Sure. Hi, my name's Don Slayman. I work for the Electrical Workers, IBEW, International Brotherhood Electrical Workers, Local 26 here in Washington, D.C. Before that, I actually worked for the National AFL-CIO and worked in 39 states. And before that, I was the director of the Moscow office from 1991 to 96. Before that, in the Balkans, trying to build independent free trade unions and trying to reform the labor markets there in Russia for 6 years, but the former Soviet Union, actually. But for this local union, and what I'd like to talk about is this local union has 14,000 members. 11,500 members. We spend $14 million on training, and that training is the key of our success, the skill and the safety that we are able to provide. But that's all dependent upon a close relationship with our employers. So our training, that $14 million we spend on training is from our contractors, and our training program is run jointly by our contractors and the local union. And our members think it's that training and skill that gives us the ability to set the market rate and to have high wages. But really, it's all about market share. And so we work with our contractors to increase market share for the unionized electrical workers within the overall electrical industry. And so we have 200 contractors that sign up with the union that are signatory to our local union. And we're trying to help grow the market of the union. We're not just competing with a non-union, which are legitimate companies with that we try to organize and get into our program. But there's also companies that there's a business model to pay of tiering the construction work down to where you hire folks that then hire all hundreds of electricians as independent contractors. And when they're independent contractors, they don't pay unemployment insurance or workers' comp or overtime, and they leave a huge tax burdens on these individuals. So, but there is a non-union sector of merit shops which don't have that kind of paying on the table, which are real competitors and are honest brokers, and that we are trying to grab market share from them. And the way we do that is by working with our contractors. And so two examples of that, and that's the two examples of this cooperation. We've held 4 events now already where we invited our small women and minority businesses, women and minority enterprises that were non-union to join with our union. The Contractors Association didn't invite them, we did. And then we invited our larger unionized contractors and to help get joint venturing opportunities, to help steer work to these new businesses if they're willing to join with us. And then just recently, 3 weeks ago, we had an event where we brought in general contractors who would hire subcontract electrical companies. And then we brought in our women and minority enterprises that were signatory to us. And we also brought in our larger electrical contractors to that. And so we had these small businesses of ours that are signatory to us. We'd like to grow these businesses. We're trying to grow their business by putting them in touch with general contractors and with larger contractors. And so we're helping to grow their business. Now, you got to remember, in the electrical and the union construction, we have, like I said, 200 contractors. About a third of those started as our members who started their own companies. And we're also doing programs to help our members start their own companies. So that's one example where we're just trying to grow the market share for the union companies and then the other thing we did was in the data center industry. So the data center industry is taking off. It's growing exponentially. And it's right here in this market of Northern Virginia and Loudoun County, where the terminus of the trunk lines from Europe and when internet was first laid out. And so because of latency, the industry is staying in this area, but there is competition to grow this industry nationwide and worldwide. Right now, Loudoun County has more data centers than the 5 largest markets below us combined. And we want to keep that work in this area. But we're having problems we have problems with the supervisors, county supervisors in Loudoun County and then the adjoining counties trying to get that work permitted. These data centers, they say there's not a lot of workers who work for the data centers, and there are maybe 20 or 30 people in the data centers, but we are employing thousands of electricians. And so nobody counts our work when they're talking about the employment numbers. And then, so we're having to convince these supervisors, these county executives that this is a great industry. It provides so much revenue. It's going to provide $500 million in revenue for this one county, Prince William County next door. Yet they're having a hard time getting past some NIMBYism of not wanting these data centers. And that $500 million would be 4 times the amount of revenue they're getting now. And that would be annually. So we bought the CEO of this project, this $30 billion data center project. And he met with the supervisors at our hall. And we brought the supervisors in 2 at a time. They can't meet more than 2 at a time outside a public meeting. And we were able to, so we're trying to get that vote to get this new project permitted. At the same time, the data center industry itself started in the military and the Defense Department, and the government. There's a lot of secrecy. And so they don't know how to get their own way of how to promote the industry. So we're working with the Data Center Trade Association on promoting the industry. And so, it's up to the union, other than the data center industry doesn't know how to promote itself, and they're competing with each other. So it's up to the union to try to get the general public in this area to understand the benefits of this industry. It's millions of dollars of revenue. It's an industry that we'd love to keep here, and we are constantly refurbishing the data centers. People think once they're built, nobody works there, but on a constant basis, every time a new company, a new bank, or somebody wants to put their cloud somewhere, we have to go in and add that cloud to the existing data center. So we're just trying to grow the market for our contractors, put our people to work. And so they depend upon us to help grow the market and to recruit, and we train folks together.
Interesting. So one of the things, I have like a little list of notes here of topics I want to talk about. And one of the things is, so at least in some of these relationships that we deal with between labor and management, it was not so lovey-dovey, and it was much more acrimonious, sort of what I would call old school. So I'm curious about, in situations where that got better and that changed to more cooperative, like what did it? What sort of, I call them levers, what sort of levers were pulled to make the other side come to see the light that it might be better to be cooperative than to fight? And I'll start with you, Lisa, if that's okay.
Sure, Justin. I think it's really easy, and it's a bad habit that, that there can be just this, and I've got a really difficult police negotiation I just started yesterday, and this is one I'm not sure I could ever crack, to be honest, but I think about similar situations that started that way. And I've got a business representative who is just, he's got feelings and thoughts and examples not vetted, right? So, what he has heard from perhaps his membership, but hasn't been, we haven't been given the time to be able to explain and give a full explanation. And so, this particular individual, and I've known this individual, right, in different negotiations, but just, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to deal with it. And trying to get a more human element to that, and really pushing in negotiations to have a full explanation. So, okay, there's a proposal on the table, right? It's easy to say, no, we don't want that, right? We're not going to agree to that. It's too much money, whatever the issue is. And really, I'm data driven when I'm responding to proposals, right? So if we say we can't do it, if I was on the other side, I'd say, okay, so what? We think you can. And so, I think, first of all, it's sharing data and being upfront. And that's a little harder when I'm in the public sector bargaining. We've got a very open FOIA law here. And so, all of this information is available. With the private company, it's a little more difficult because, you've got, especially not a publicly traded company, you've got, a president or a CEO who may not be as forthcoming on that information. So I'm really, I guess my experience has really been in the public sector on this issue. But, first of all, providing the information, being thorough about it, understanding the information you're providing it, being able to explain what it is and where it comes from. I think those are, it's because if you're just swatting the other side away and saying, no, we're just not going to do that, right? It's disrespectful. You're not going to get, you're seeking to get understanding, right? That's because where I sit, right, I've got a small team. I might be going to the city. I'll be going to the city council at some point, but I recognize that on the other side of the table is a potentially very large membership who have very different issues. And, it is my hope when I provide that the representatives of the table will share that, and that explanation will be made to the people who need to hear it, right? And so I think it's being respectful about your responses and being able to provide the information that supports it. I may have someone on my team who thinks this is the dumbest thing that's ever been requested, or there's no way we're ever going to agree to that. And that's fine. But we've got to be they thought it was important, or a portion of the membership thought it was important. So we have to be able to, to explain why, why we can't do all of it, or why we can't do any of it. And I think it's, I have found that, and this was not always something I have done. So I think that's a really important point, but I've kind of learned that this is a really important part of a response. And by sharing this kind of information, hopefully we can have more trust. And, you know, and I oftentimes on my side of the table have people say, we're not doing that, you know, and so then I have to have that conversation with my client to say, well, let me explain to you why we should, or how about we provide this kind of information? And I always think that, you know, being on the union side and having to represent all these diverse member views and everybody's proposal is the most important. I have a little bit of that on my side too, where I have to negotiate with my client, you know, to, in this case, to provide information and be comfortable sharing that information.
Yeah, I often tell my union clients, they don't always want to believe that there is as much politics on your side of the table as there is on mine. That's hard to believe. Katie, what in the ones that you've worked on have taken companies from wanting to put all the union officials in jail and converted them to see the light that they should really deal with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, I always sort of look at labor relations in these three phases, essentially: the organizing, the negotiating, and then kind of the day-to-day relations once the union is recognized and the contract's in place. And so I might speak a bit to that, the organizing piece of it, right? Because I think that is especially where the acrimony can exist, because that is probably the place, well, negotiating to a certain degree, but where you really get the mindset of a zero-sum game, right? Either the union wins an election or it loses, right? There's sort of one or the other there. And I think that often, knowing that sort of that's the climate, it definitely becomes sort of an us against them. And have, you know, I think, as with probably all of us, had experiences with that level of acrimony being, you know, at a fever pitch. And so how you go from there to anything that resembles peace or cooperation, at least coexistence, can it sometimes seem, you know, just not possible. But, you know, I think in the experience that I've had, both of the Teamsters and a state-based and a national union, and also at a global union level, you know, I think four key things that I think from a union perspective we've taken into account. The first is, you know, we may be raising issues, waving our hands to an employer, and you know, I think often it's more the response is dismissiveness, right? You know, just not even, they're not going to acknowledge the issues, they're not going to give us the time of day, they're not going to recognize us. And so I think we start from a place of, how do we sort of ensure our seat at the table, right? Doing that through increasing union density strategically, right? So if we only represent 2% of the workers and we're talking about all these problems, it's kind of not the strongest position to be in. But as we continue to grow and win union elections, or get recognition globally, strategically, maybe in contracts or in places that we know the operations are larger, you reach a point where you feel like management, the company has to recognize you, has to have that conversation. So I think getting to that point is incredibly important, and at times can be a bit of a chicken and the egg if it's a really bad relationship. But I think the second piece, and I know that Lisa mentioned in the negotiations being very data driven, same thing goes when it comes to organizing and the issues that a union may want to raise with company. You know, I find that how important credibility really is, right? So making sure you make a strong argument that is backed up by the facts, right? And I think we've all been there where, you know, we have either members on the union side or, you know, a local manager, and it's emotional, right? And all of a sudden, you know, the things that become someone else's fault, and it's all very foggy and vague. And when you start asking the hard questions and you're like, okay, this may not be as big of an issue, or one we can resolve another way. And so really being self-critical, I find, is been helpful, where the union has to ask itself the hard questions about our argument. Do we really have the facts to back up this argument? If we don't, we need to go get them. And if we can't find them, then it's probably not that good of an argument, right? So just being really honest with ourselves, because I think then that helps when you bring the issues to the company, to an employer. You're already at a place where you can feel very confident in your position. And then thirdly, I'd say this really important piece of who the decision makers really are, right? Making sure you're talking to the right people. And I think often you can find that there's various stakeholders involved, various decision makers at different levels, and just making sure that you're making sure that the conversation that's happening is to the person that can make the decision, has the power to do so. And frankly, what we found when those things don't work and the relationship is still as toxic and vicious as you can imagine. Frankly, that is, I think, the point where my experience in unions, we start to implement more of what we call leverage campaigns, right? If the company isn't going to come and meet with us, isn't going to respond to our issues, isn't going to listen, isn't going to, kind of make space for us, we're going to make it more difficult for them not to, right? And so that's when it comes into outreach to the various stakeholders involved, clients, if it's a private organization, public, cities, counties, states, everyone has a constituency, right? And that's, I always sort of feel like, I don't want to say it's the nuclear option, but it's an escalating effort, right? And I think try those things first, right? And if it doesn't work, escalate. I also suggest not that, it's rarely works well if unions drop the hammer before we've done anything else. If for no other reason, if dropping the hammer doesn't work, we don't have anywhere else to go, right? So the idea of let's create space and opportunity for the cooperation to happen. And if it doesn't, then you ratchet it up. Obviously, I think there's been cases where even doing all these things, we've still not been successful, but by far and away, the successes that I've seen and been a part of took those factors into consideration.
So am I sort of getting it right, Katie, that if you get to the point you're doing one of these leverage campaigns, the idea is not success of the leverage campaign is not necessarily we're going to drive you into the ground, maybe out of business until you come pleading for help. It's more that we're going to show you that you'd be better off just dealing with us than dealing with the daily misery of us bad-mouthing you to your shareholders and to your customers and to everything else. Is that kind of the idea?
I think so. And I think part of that, to be successful at that, again, it's sort of more internal on the union side, is to be very clear about what your demands are. What does a win look like? Because I think when you get in the heat of battle, sometimes that can get lost, right? And so not only making sure you know what your demands are and what you expect, but that the employer does as well, right? Because at some point, whenever I start a leverage campaign, the very first thing you do is make your demands known to the company. Give them the chance to say yes. The minute they say no, they understand what the consequences of that are. And I think you're right. In my experience, it comes to a point where it's a cost benefit analysis, right? And if at some point an employer, you reach that tipping point and they just rather deal with you than continue to pay the money, to risk the reputational risk or whatever else may be associated with the leverage campaign that we'd be running.
So for Don, it was slightly different, maybe overlapping question. When you think about how to get, to a more cooperative type situation instead of just ramming your heads against each other with the contractors, like what do you, in terms of advice, what do you wish your counterparts, so the people on the contractor side, what do you wish they understood better about what the unions are trying to do?
I think we showed them the electrical market construction market is very differentiated. So when this data center market boomed, so we've grown by 4,500 members. When that market boomed, we had to go out and get we couldn't. Our apprenticeship program wasn't big enough. Our day apprenticeship program to get all the electricians needed for that market. So we stripped the non-union. We went and organized the non-union into our either into our apprenticeship, but also we have night classes. So you're able to become a journey person by taking these night classes. All these classes are free, but it's much easier to go take the apprenticeship during the day and get paid to come in to train than come in on your own time at night and the training's free, but you still got to give your time. So when there was this boom in that data center industry, we were able to help our contractors by bringing in 4,000 new electricians in the last 5 years, 4,500 new electricians. They couldn't recruit on their own those kinds of numbers. They had to depend upon us, and they relied on us to do the screening of those workers. So they had that faith in us. At the same time, at the lower end of the market, mixed use residential, where this wage step comes in. There's actually a $1 billion company out of Florida whose business model is to perpetrate wage step, is to design a tiering of the work so that in the end, you tailorize the work. It's not as skilled as in a data center. You tailorize the work. If you're building an apartment, you just teach them to do one thing 100 times all the way up in every room, up and down the apartment. And so in this case, we were able to get those workers and put them in a training program so they knew more than just that one task. And we were able to give them careers. And so we were able to help keep that market. As we grew in the data center market, we didn't lose our contractors who were in mixed use residential, and we didn't lose that market because we went out there and aggressively recruited and aggressively trained. The contractors couldn't do that on their own. So it's really that we were nimble enough to when the market was, one end of the market was growing and another end of the market was being subject to a lot of competition, they saw our value. Before I got here, there was the union was a growing union, but it was the market wasn't allowed to grow in that rapidly. And there was a leader who was very narcissistic, and the contract association leader was also had been there 20 years. And so once those two individuals got out of the way, it also helped. The main help was the market conditions and the union responding and the contractors noticing. The other thing you have to remember is the contractors association has 4 people, whereas we have about 45 staff, and you counted admin and business agents and referral agents. And so they couldn't do that. They couldn't do all the market they couldn't do any legislation. They have to rely on us to do legislation and lobbying and to set up the atmosphere of how the industry is perceived. We created a scholarship and diversity. So not only are we opening up and providing opportunities for folks to get in the industry through creating a lot of pre-apprenticeship programs, teaching soft skills as an entry into our union, but we also created a scholarship and diversity at the top end of our industry so that we're having mentors of women minorities at the top of the industry. So we created a scholarship of construction management. So we're able to do these things and engage the community that the Contractors Association can't do because they don't have the personnel and staff time that benefits the entire organized, the signatory contractors, so the union space within the electrical industry. So they've come, once they saw our ability to be nimble and supply the labor and train it up and help screen for them, they had more faith in us. So now it's just built on its own. And so until negotiations start, everything's really amicable, really amicable. And we feel that negotiations, we don't want to price ourselves out of the market, and they understand that inflation happen. And, so, I mean, I think that we built this trust up that I think is not going to go away in the next, until market conditions create some kind of crisis where we can't be successful in helping out our contractors.
So when I think about this, I think it's a continuum from acrimonious relationship to totally lovey-dovey and we're all doing great. So my next question is, and with Lisa, I recognize I'm going to tread very lightly, and that I wouldn't want anybody to criticize a past or current client. But when you've got a relationship that you'd like to at least move the needle a little bit down the continuum, even if pie in the sky is that it's going to be totally cooperative, but you'd like to make it a little bit more so. What do you wish to people on your side of the table? What do you have the hardest time sort of convincing them of, or them to understand on your own side of the table that could make this a better situation?
Yeah, I think the value of labor management meetings, the value of hearing the union out, or hearing the position. And I get it, everybody has a lot of meetings. I think that's, to push that sometimes is, I just get a groan and no, you got to be kidding me. But I think there is a lot of value in, in sitting down and at least hearing a point of view and considering it. It may not change where things go. I think that is, but I think it's, if there's value, sometimes it's just, the other side just wants to be heard and they want to have that opportunity. And, in contracts, right, sometimes we negotiate that as part of the process, but sometimes we negotiate a meet and confer, right, which is something less than a requirement for a negotiation. I find with a lot of my clients, particularly my municipal clients, is that they are so busy. Some of them have 12, 14 collective bargaining agreements. They are just so busy getting to the next thing that it becomes very transactional. And this is a people process. I mean, this is I always say to my clients when they're like, well, how do you bargain? What is that? Like, it's an art. It's not a science. There's a lot of ways to get to an agreement. And I think when sometimes my clients look at this as being, okay, we're going to do it the way we did it last time, and it's going to be transactional, and we're going to, we're only going to have this number meetings, and we got to get there. And that does not allow for creativity. It does not allow for the conversations that might get you to a place where you can get those issues resolved more easily.
Interesting. That's probably not something I would have thought of either. So Katie, my next question's to you. So I've represented unions for like 23 years, and I swear I have known union officials over the years that they want to just fight, and they sometimes even lose sight of what it is they're fighting about. They just want to fight because they've got some old vendetta they're trying to exercise. So what kind of hurdles do you run into on the union side of getting the union officials, both elected and, staff people, to see the light, and that maybe ramming our head against the other side over and over is not the best way to go?
No, absolutely. And yes, I agree. Those, as you described, union officials exist, but I would suggest they're in the minority, right? I mean, I think they're the loudest and often the most brash, but for the most part, I think you do find that there are folks that do want to get the job done. I know I've become a bit of a broken record, but again, I think one of the most kind of sensitive times and kind of a make or break time is that period after an election for a union, right? And then when you transition from organizing, winning an election, and then now representing those workers and negotiating contracts, because I think often it's the organizing itself is that fight. It's that battle. It's to make sure every vote comes in for you, and it's either coming in for you or it's coming in for the other guy. But when, election day is not the end, it's the beginning of the next phase, right? And if you approach that next phase with that same sort of zero-sum attitude, I think that's where you see a lot of difficulty, and frankly, a lot of difficulty for delivering for your members if you're a union leader, right? And so I think that conversation that we've had over the years with union officials in that transition point from one to the other is really key. And we may have had a lot of nasty things to say about one another during the organizing phase, and now we got to sit across the table and try to find common ground. It's difficult. I get it, right? But again, I think you have union leaders that really are committed to delivering for their members, representing their members' interests, hopefully improving their quality of life and work life. And so it's sort of getting past that emotional bit to the, okay, what can we get done and how can we get it done? And so I think that little moment there is important. And just like, again, that idea, I'll just take it from the global perspective as well. Just this idea that it gets maybe more to the question you were asking about what we would want the other side to consider. And that the idea that I think unions at the end of the day, what we're fighting for is a shift in that model away from a race to the bottom, right? In any sort of industry where there's any sort of procurement happening, right? It's going to come down to bids coming in, and client wants to spend as little as they can, right? We understand how this works, right? So at the end of the day, the race to the bottom does not benefit responsible companies out there, right? Because there's always going to be a bottom feeder that can underbid, right? And so the reality is, I think the push that you'll see unions make, that is to try to flip that on the head, to fight for contracts based on the quality of the service you can provide, the stability, whatever it might be. That benefits the workers, absolutely. It benefits the unions, but I think it also plays a role where it can benefit the good, responsible companies out there. And very similar to what Don was saying, increase the market share of these responsible companies and help to raise those standards where you get to a point where frankly, bottom feeders need not apply, right? And so I just wanted to add that bit in too.
And I saw, as you're saying that, I see Don over there nodding his head up and down, that, and is it right, Don, am I putting it right, that for the unions and the contractors, the good contractors, and I'll, even if it's limited to the union, responsible union contractors, I mean, the common enemy really there is the bottom feeder contractors, and that's not in anybody's best interest, arguably even the public's best interest, right?
Correct. There's plenty of non-union contractors that we don't mind competing with. It's on a fair basis. It's the ones that are, not paying unemployment insurance, workers' comp taxes on their employees, shoveling all the Social Security on the employee when really the employees every moment of the day is dictated to. So it's unfairly saying they're independent contractors. So as long as a playing field is even, we're willing to compete. We think that our training and will win out, but we can't compete union and non-union with folks that violate the Fair Standards of Labor Act, a 100-year-old law, and it's violated every day. I mean, some crafts, it's the majority of the work is done like that, the gigging of the economy. So like in some of the other construction crafts that aren't licensed like us, they don't have enough contractors to even to compete. So it's you can't let it get out. You can't let it, like Katie said, you can get it to where you eliminate the bottom feeders if you can really clean up the industry. That's the goal.
Yeah. One of the things, going back to sort of, I think it was maybe even Katie's intro talk about, she used the term economic employers, and she used it like in the big corporate sense, international. But I think of that an analogy of at local and state governments where they use contractors for a lot of services. I see like the city as an economic employer, and a union might be having maybe they're trying to organize, they're collectively bargain, they're already organized with one of these contractors who maybe do recycling pickup or school bus services. I'm curious, and I don't know, Lisa, if you have any of that from dealing with local governments and their contractors as their management lawyer. How does that role play well? How can the role of the so-called economic employer, and I'm thinking local government in this case, how can that help the relationship at the bargaining table?
I'm not sure how to address that. Can you I guess I'm the idea of an economic employer. Can you flesh that out a little bit, Justin?
Yeah, so I deal sometimes, say, with, like I said, contractors that do work for local governments.
Mm-hmm.
And the contractor's answer to everything is, we can't afford that because we don't get paid enough. And my answer is, well, you need to provide better services that are safer. Your trucks are out of, the brakes are bad on the trucks and the buses, you're transporting kids, whatever. I'm going to go to your school board or to your city council and complain that the contractor they're using is totally substandard, not living up to what the city expects. And I'm wondering, that's fraught, because then we're getting into politics. And I'm wondering what you think of whether or not that's helpful to the process or not helpful.
Yeah, what I find is that, and there's a pretty strict bidding process in Illinois for public sector employers. I can't think that I've actually ever had that happen. But, my concern certainly is that, somebody who doesn't understand the nuances of it. I mean, the bid documents are generally enormous, right? And, you've really got to understand what it is, what is the city actually providing to its citizens? What are the different components? I mean, even like, garbage and recycling, it's complicated, right? It's not simple. I think requiring the preference, of course, and I do see this happen a lot, where employees go directly to the school board or the city council on issues that haven't been vetted, with management. And that is, there's no better way to ruin a relationship or any kind of trust. And I mean, I get it. Listen, if you're not getting a response and you've tried to address it directly with the administration, that's a different set of facts. But I think not giving the administration the opportunity within the confines of the labor management relationship to address the concerns. Again, the union might not like the answer. And at that point, they can do what they want. But I think anytime, and I have, anytime union officials go directly to the elected officials, it is not going to do anything good for that relationship.
I know, and I know I've been not the best on that sometimes too with my clients. If we run to the elected officials to complain, when maybe we could have done a bit more to sort of avoid that and lay some better groundwork. We're almost out of time. I think we have about 5 minutes left on the official time. Does anybody have any questions for the panel members or anybody? It's because they were all so smart that there was nothing left to ask, right?
Could I just say one observation?
Of course. Go ahead, Don.
When I worked overseas in the transition from communism to oligarchy, the workers always assumed activists were bad people. Those are the ones who actually believed in communism, and so I had to make folks understand that the individual that stood up and fought were good for everybody, because when they stood up and fought, everybody else got it, like a grievance. Everybody else benefited from what they won because it was then given to everyone in the contract. And that this idea that unions actually reduce conflict, because without a union, you're going to have 100 people fighting for the same issue. Nobody knows about it. They're fighting their own individual issue and it gets resolved. You're having these multiple conflicts. But with the union in a situation, whatever the union wins for that one grievance applies to everyone. So you don't have to fight the same fight 100 times, so you have less conflict. The other thing I wanted to mention was we were just helping the bus drivers here in one of these counties. The bus service had been underbid, and then the workers went on strike, and so the supervisors gave them more money to the company, but the company just used it as overtime, so it didn't change the wage structure. So then they went back out on strikes, and so then the supervisors had the company come before and admit that they underbid it, and then the supervisors added more money to the contract, but was strict regulation on how that money would change the wage structure. So actually, the supervisors were willing to do that as long as the company verbally told the general public they underbid, and so.
And to be clear, when Don's talking supervisors, he means county supervisors, elected officials, not supervisors that are bossing you around at your work all day. Yeah. So I think we're just about done, unless somebody has something else. Thanks to our panel members. As for Katie, we will invite you back again, but our next session will have to be in London or somewhere more interesting in person, maybe. And I like Chicago too, so I'm always happy to go there. So thank you very much for participating, to the three of you, Don, Katie, and Lisa, and to everybody who attended. We keep an eye on our email list and so on for our future events. We have September 14th is our annual in-person event in Richmond. That's a full day conference that we're looking forward to. I think last year we had 70 or so participants. We're planning a few more than that this year, but there will be more to come. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.